What if Scar was just the decoy? I mean, yeah, he's evil, dramatic, dripping with Shakespearean flair and betrayal. But what if Scar was never the true villain of The Lion King? What if he was just the symptom, not the sickness? I started thinking about this after scrolling through a thread on r/Lion King where someone posted, "Scar was terrible, sure, but everything he did was just too easy. Why was it so easy for one lion to collapse the entire kingdom?" That question hit me like a stampede of wildebeests. Because honestly, how does a single lion manipulate an entire royal structure so thoroughly that the Pridelands fall into famine in what? A few moons? And that's when I found it. There's a whisper across Facebook groups and old DeviantArt lore pages. Some might call it fanon. Others a conspiracy theory that the real villain of the Pridelands was never Scar. It was Mufasa. Yeah. Let that sit for a second. Now, before you clutch your pearls or your copy of The Lion Guard, this theory doesn't paint Mufasa as some maniacal overlord. It's subtler than that, more insidious. Think benevolent dictator with a god complex. Let's rewind. On Twitter, @SimbaSoul93 posted a breakdown of Mufasa's rule saying, "Notice how Mufasa never trains Simba in diplomacy, only dominance. Circle of life this, destiny that, but never a whisper of counsel or conversation with the other animals. It's all about hierarchy." And I think that's the point. Mufasa was so focused on passing down power that he never taught Simba how to share it. Everything in the kingdom bowed to Mufasa, literally. Rafiki, Zazu, even the hyenas were pushed out and punished for not knowing their place. The Outlands didn't become the Outlands until someone was deemed less than. Mufasa didn't just rule the land, he defined who deserved to exist in it. Now, you might be asking, what about the hyenas? Surely they were the villains too, right? Well, go back and rewatch the original Lion King. The hyenas didn't start the war, they were starving, desperate, laughing through the pain. As Tumblr user Scar Sympathizer, yeah, that's a real username, once posted, if the circle of life is so balanced, why are the hyenas always on the outside of it? That's when it clicked. Maybe Scar wasn't trying to destroy the Pridelands. Maybe he was trying to reset it. Let's look at the dynamic between Scar and Mufasa for a second. There's this line that always haunts me. When Scar tells Simba, "I'm from the shallow end of the gene pool." It's meant as a joke, but think about what he's really saying. He was never meant to be king. Not because he wasn't capable, but because Mufasa made sure of it. A Reddit post in R Fan Theories argues, Scar had an intellect that was seen as dangerous in a system where physical strength equaled leadership. Mufasa never shared power with his brother, never gave him responsibility. Of course, Scar turned bitter. And isn't that kind of relatable? Imagine living in your brother's shadow your entire life, never being seen as worthy no matter what you contribute. And then one day you realize your only path to power is through chaos. Because that's the only language your kingdom understands. But here's where it gets darker. One tweet I found from @Hyena Historian laid it out plainly. The tragedy of Scar isn't that he was evil, it's that he believed he had to be. That stopped me. Because what if Mufasa knew what would happen? What if he knew how broken the system was and chose to maintain it anyway? Power was never supposed to be shared. Not with Scar, not with the hyenas, not even with Simba, really, unless Simba towed the exact same line Mufasa had drawn. Scar might have killed Mufasa, but Mufasa built the world where betrayal was the only way to be seen. Now, obviously, this theory isn't the mainstream one. It's not in the Disney books. You won't find it in the Circle of Life sing-along. But scroll through enough Facebook comments and you'll see the cracks. I always felt uneasy during Mufasa's speech to Simba, one user wrote. Like he was grooming a future king, not raising a son. And I felt that too. The way Mufasa speaks with such certainty about the rightful order. The way he dismisses Simba's curiosity with answers like, "Because I said so," dressed in poetic philosophy. It's the same voice used by rulers who believe their version of peace is the only one that matters. So maybe, just maybe, Scar didn't fail the Pridelands. The Pridelands failed him. And you know what? That theory alone would have been wild enough, but then I saw a thread on Facebook that took it even further. A user named Leona.mk wrote, "Scar was just the executioner. The real puppet master might have been Rafiki." Rafiki. That blew my mind. The wise old mandrill who paints on trees and talks in riddles might have been the kingdom's most calculating strategist. Think about it. He's always there, always observing. He doesn't lead, but he never loses influence either. When Mufasa dies, he's the first to accept it. When Simba runs, Rafiki vanishes until it's time to bring him back, just in time for the throne. Almost like he was preserving the monarchy, like he needed the system to survive more than any one lion. A popular TikTok theory even goes deeper. It suggests Rafiki saw Scar as an unworthy king, not because of morality, but because Scar disrupted the bloodline. It was never about balance, it was about legacy. And Rafiki, as the spiritual guide, had one job: to protect that legacy at any cost, even if it meant manipulating a traumatized cub back into battle. And that brings us to Simba, the golden prince, the prodigal son. But let's not forget, Simba lived with guilt his entire life, and that guilt wasn't born from Scar. It was planted the second he saw Mufasa fall. Scar may have said the words, "It's your fault," but Simba believed it so easily. Why? Because Mufasa had raised him to think perfection was the price of worthiness. This isn't just me projecting. There's a YouTube comment with 8K likes that says, "Simba's entire arc is about unlearning the emotional repression Mufasa taught him. Hakuna Matata isn't laziness, it's freedom from inherited pressure." I nearly shouted yes when I read that. Because how often do we look at Simba's time with Timon and Pumbaa as failure, as weakness? But maybe it was the first time he was allowed to just be, to laugh, to breathe, to exist outside the circle of life. But of course that peace couldn't last. Because Rafiki came calling, because the stars spoke, because destiny demanded Simba return. And he did, with no plan, no army, just a roar and a ghost in the sky telling him who he was. Let that sink in. The moment Simba reclaims the throne, the land instantly begins to heal. The rains return, the music swells, Scar dies, and nature itself seems to applaud. But isn't that suspicious? Redditor Sun Drought Theory suggested it's like the land was cursed until the rightful king returned. Not because of nature, but because of narrative control. We're watching a story where fate favors the monarchy, not the people. And that hits a little too close, because when you think about it, Scar didn't destroy the land. The drought did, the famine did, and yet all of that is magically resolved once Simba steps onto the rock. Was it divine intervention, or just myth-making? That's where this theory gets uncomfortable, because it challenges everything we thought we knew. What if Scar wasn't evil, just excluded? What if Rafiki wasn't wise, just loyal to an outdated ideal? And what if Mufasa wasn't the king we remember, but a lion who built a kingdom that could only survive through fear and obedience? Even the ending of The Lion King 2 adds layers to this. The moment Simba meets Zira, Scar's most devoted follower, he refuses to listen. He's learned nothing about why Scar had followers in the first place. He exiles Kovu before ever giving him a chance. Twitter user @KovuKing posted, "Simba became the thing he feared, a king so protective of the crown that he forgot who was hurting underneath it." And it's true. Zira's pride didn't just wake up one day wanting war. They were cast out, ignored, left to rot in the same way Scar once was. The cycle just keeps going. Now here's where my opinion comes in. Do I think Mufasa was a villain? Not in the Scar sense, he wasn't malicious, but he was a product of the same system he upheld. And that system, the rigid circle of life, the obsession with destiny, the strict lines of power, is what created every tragedy in the franchise. From Scar's bitterness, to Simba's trauma, to Zira's vengeance, it all stems from one core flaw. A kingdom where power is inherited, not earned. Where voices are silenced if they don't sound royal enough. Where every solution leads back to a throne. Maybe the real villain of The Lion King was the monarchy itself. And here's the twist no one really talks about. Even when peace is restored, it's fragile. Because The Lion King ends with a pretty picture. Simba roaring atop Pride Rock, his cub held high. But in The Lion Guard, we see the cracks almost immediately. Kaon is born with the roar, but instead of being celebrated, he's sent away. Symbolically exiled like Scar once was, all in the name of training. But training for what? For who? The Tree of Life? A destiny that's never his own? Instagram user @LionQueenLaw pointed this out in a story highlight. The roar doesn't belong to the royal line. It chooses. But every time it chooses someone outside the throne, that lion gets pushed away. Scar banished, Kion isolated. Even Vitani, who eventually leads the Lion Guard, gets her moment only because everyone else is gone. The Roar challenges the hierarchy, and the hierarchy rejects it every time. And let's talk about that ending scene in Kion and Rani's story, the one that breaks the internet every time someone brings it up. The one where the cubs are born, Raiko and Asher. One born with the Roar, the other with something far more dangerous. That line still gives me chills, because it means the cycle might not just repeat, it might rupture. There's a theory floating around TikTok that Asher, the smaller, fierce cub, might be the true inheritor of something beyond the Roar. A power the Pridelands have never seen. One not born of legacy, but of change, of disruption. As one user put it, the Roar chose wrong. The circle is breaking. And maybe that's the point, because sometimes the system doesn't need a savior. It needs a revolution. So where does that leave us? With a story that's far more complex than good lions versus bad lions. One where Scar's pain was rooted in exclusion, where Mufasa's power came with blind spots, where Simba's trauma was inherited, and where Rafiki, guardian of balance, may have preserved order at the cost of justice. It's a story about legacy, about how easy it is to protect tradition even when tradition hurts people, and about how the ones we call villains might just be the voices we never wanted to hear. Scar was never just the enemy. He was the echo of everything the kingdom refused to face. And if the whispers are true, if Raiko and Asher are the future, then the roar we hear next might not be one of kingship. It might be the sound of something new being born, something that doesn't bow. Because maybe the real circle of life was never meant to stay unbroken.